Hi, this is Mark Leggett. Welcome to today's RDA COVID-19 Working Group update. We'll start the webinar in just a couple of minutes. We'll give more people a chance to log in.
Okay.
All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. So today's webinar is an update on the COVID-19 Working Group and the efforts that have been unfolding over the last month and a half or so. My name's Mark Leggett, and I'm one of the co-chairs for the working group, and working with a great group of folks to bring this effort to the larger community. So we're going to talk about the upcoming release, the 5th release, coming due later this week. We'll kind of do an update on the process and how things are working towards the final release. Some of the highlights that are coming out of this latest release, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. If you do have questions, there's you can put them into the questions section of the GoToMeeting function. It's a little easier if you do use the questions tab, because if they go into chat, we may miss them. So just as a reminder, this effort started in mid-late March, and its goal is to clearly define guidelines for data sharing under the current COVID-19 pandemic context, and allow stakeholders, whether you're researchers or funders or policymakers or providers of services to those organizations, that these guidelines will help follow best practices. So part of that, as I mentioned, with policymakers, so some of the components of the document that's really going to be released soon include recommendations for policymakers. And as I said, we're interested in all of the key stakeholders in the community and facilitating best practices for data sharing. As part of that effort, we're coming up to the 5th release this week, so I'm going to ask Natalie, who's co-chairing the editorial team, to provide an update on what's happening. Natalie?
Thanks, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. I'm just going to paste right now into the, yeah, I'm just pasting into the chat. Oh, it doesn't look as nice in the chat as it did on my screen, but all the direct links to all the documents I'm going to talk about here, because I know you can't click on the slides from where they are here. So, okay, 5th release. There is a link to the 5th release working doc. Just make sure if you're going into it that you're in the right one. If you're in the wrong one, it says it in bright pink. This is the wrong document. So highlights for this next release. This is unusual for our timeline in that we're talking about this release before we've actually put it out, because we had a longer time period this time. So a major highlight is we're going to have a whole new section on Indigenous data, and we're going to hear about what's going to be contained in that later in this webinar. We have a glossary of terms and acronyms It's quite large at this point. I think there's over 180 terms. So we have to see what we're going to do with that, if we'll keep all those terms or if we'll whittle it down. But that's quite an important kind of deliverable in a sense on its own, because it brings together various terms that would be quite useful in this area, and I think for infectious diseases in general in terms of data. So that's another thing. Overall, we're really moving towards the kind of final editorial changes that we have to make to the document. So there's been a lot of work on that, a major editorial effort across the board. So I wanted to thank all of the groups, all the people in the groups, the editorial team, the editorial representatives, which are individuals that are kind of liaising with us from each of the groups. So there's a kissy emoji in thanks for everyone. So to give an example of some of those major efforts, I'll highlight a couple of things. So for example, with an effort at alliteration here, there's an epic epi effort. They've whittled their document down quite significantly to a very tight contribution. They're going to have separate longer releases outside of this. We've done a huge sweep to standardize citations in the document. So the decision, after much looking around and trying to find what people were doing and standardize things as best we could, is that in text is author, last name, comma, year, or if there's more than one author, we're going to simply go with author, last name, et al, comma, year. So there'll be changes to some of the ways that the groups did it, but that was the best compromise we could come to be consistent with the citations. There was a huge check. Every single link in the doc was checked by Mary and Megan on the editorial team to see if it resolves. And also they were checked to make sure that those links are in Zotero using the cited resource tag. There is time for the groups to go back when I get to a later slide to double check these, but that was that big effort was done. And then there's a new ordering in this release as well. And if we go to the next slide, please, Mark, can speak to that. Oh, I'm not seeing the picture on this slide. So, oh, there it is. Great. So this is a reworking of that original diagram that's on the RDA website to explain the structure of the group, and it's now been reworked kind of in order to show to match how we're approaching things in the document. So the sections go like this. They go clinical, omics, epidemiology, and social sciences. And then after much discussion with community participation, that group, and with the chairs and moderators, it was decided that their group fits better as a cross-cutting theme. It makes more sense there. So in brown, you see the 4 cross-cutting themes that are in the document, and that's the order that they're going to be in. So that's the new structure for the document, and it's already been put in place, I think, like hours after the previous release went out. Next slide, please.
Take some time.
Yeah, they are slow. I'm sure Mark is pressing it instantly, but it takes time for it to show up.
Yeah, I am. It's funny.
I know. I was stressed out when I had to do it last time.
Do you
Okay,
have it?
I have it now. Yep, I think everybody hopefully can see it. Okay, so I gave highlights, but again, this is a work in progress because we're not releasing this until this Thursday, which means we're trying to finalize all the major parts today by the end of the day so that we can do a full copy edit on the 27th, and then whatever else we need to do to get it out there with the press release and the rest on the 28th. So things that are still in progress right now, the legal and ethical cross-cutting theme group is looking at all of the sections to see if there's anything that kind of contradicts or could be used to add to the legal and ethical section, et cetera. So we're trying to make sure that there's consistency on this across the document. And I believe their procedure is to put comments next to any areas where there might be something that needs discussion. So we'll make our best effort on that for this release. we've asked for the groups to provide input to a press release that will go out. We'll also use that same input into the writing of the executive summary. And essentially that's to highlight a recommendation and a guideline coming from your particular group. So the editorial reps were asked to kind of take the lead on that one because they're the ones kind of doing all the other editorial bits on the document right now. So if those could come in by the end of today, that would be very helpful so that work can start on the press release tomorrow. You guys asked, a number of people, moderators and contributors asked for a sanity check period. So, you know, you've done all this work to edit everything and put it into the new structure, and then we've kind of, editorial teams taken it away from you in a sense to do the overarching things. So we're gonna open it up again today at 4 p.m. UTC until 10 a.m. on the 27th UTC. So that period of time covers awake and office hours as best as possible for all the time zones involved in this, so that the groups can go in and double check things. The kind of things we'd like you to really take a look at is, you know, make sure that your references are still in good shape. We shouldn't have changed anything in any negative way. Hopefully we added stuff that was missing, but take a look at that. Also, please add to the contributors list names of contributors and ORCID IDs if you have them. And there's a separate spreadsheet there. It's linked in the chat and also linked on the slide right here. And there are editorial guidelines if you have any questions that you can look at as well. So I mentioned the citation style before. It's in the editorial guidelines. We're also using UK English. And another thing, this is not a new section, but it's got a new number. So section 13, additional resources. The purpose of this is for you to add links to any resources that you have not cited directly in the body of the text that you've written, resources that you have not tagged as cited, oops, I spelled that wrong, as cited resource in Zotero. So these are additional, generally, you know, usually more general resources that you would like to point people to, but that wouldn't show up because the way that we're pulling the resource list is from everything that's cited resource. And we don't want it to show up in the resource list and in the additional resources. That's why we don't want you to tag it as cited resource. And then there's the link to where this release is going to be published, which is the same place that it's been published before, and go out to community comment. Okay, next slide, please. Which is my final slide. It's a surprise. No, here it is. This is the updated timeline. The only update from our last webinar is the bit in red there, which I just mentioned, the sanity check period for the groups to go back in, take a look at references, contributors. No major changes are expected at this time, because if you make any major changes, then that could have a knock-on effect that the ed team would have to look at. So minor ones if possible. And yep, the rest of the timeline remains the same. So 5th release going out on the 28th, 10-day community comment period for feedback that will end June 8th. Then we've got about a week there to incorporate that community feedback, create the finalized document, and send it to the various bodies in RDA for endorsement. We gave them a very short period of time for that, which is the 22nd of June. Then any feedback that comes from them also has to be incorporated. There'll be graphic design and, you know, setup of the document and that sort of thing for a final endorsed release on the 30th of June. And that's it for me for now. Thanks, Mark.
All right, thanks, Natalie. And I think Rob put his finger on the reason why the slides are taking a little longer with Mark at the keyboard is because of my 86-inch, no, not quite, my very large screen resolution, high screen resolution. So apologies for that. Now I'm going to call on Maggie Walter to speak to our new section on the Indigenous data guidelines. Maggie?
Yes, sure. Can you hear me, Mark?
I can, yeah.
Oh, excellent. So hello, everybody. Nice to meet you. I'm speaking here. I'm from Lutruwita, Tasmania, Australia. So I'm Maggie Walter. I'm a Palawa Professor of Sociology here at the University of Tasmania, and I've been working with our global team from our list of contributors there. We're from 4-5 different countries. So we've come together to get these Indigenous data guidelines in. We think that we will have it ready to go tomorrow to meet all the deadlines. So we've been working pretty hard. It's a new task, but I think we've come together pretty well to do that. So I just will talk a little bit about it, and then I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have of how this will fit or where we're going with it. So we see our major contribution is actually sort of bringing that research gaze. As we know, Indigenous peoples are acutely impacted from the negative health, socio and economic outcomes of COVID-19, and that's been raised by the UN Special Rapporteur. So we really want to emphasise that it's absolutely imperative that Indigenous peoples are included in all of the pandemic-related research and the planning and the history and the policy rather. And we bring to that the idea that there's a long historic misuse of Indigenous data, which brings a deep mistrust. And that's been showing up again in various countries with the COVID-19 response. And so that what we're trying to do is to make sure that we set out the obligations for funders, governments, researchers, data stewards, etc., on the ownership, collection, application, sharing and dissemination around Indigenous data. So that's where we're coming from, and we see them obviously from the last slide is as cross-cutting. So our key recommendation is we have a set of principles that we've had organised, I think, since the RDA that was originally done in the RDA meeting in Botswana. That would be November 2018. And they've been developing. Now, they're the CARE principles. Now, I know you've already got a reference to CARE principles, which are evidently Scottish health principles, but these are the CARE Indigenous data governance principles, and we've used those to set a minimal set of guidelines. So, Mark, can you bring up the next part of the slide?
Should be coming up in a few seconds.
Any minute now? Yep. So the CARE principles, we originally authored these and developed these to match the FAIR principles, because the FAIR, the findable, accessible, etc. ones, which I've noticed are just about on every page of the COVID-19 RDA guidelines, really don't encompass the needs and priorities of Indigenous peoples. So what we say is that we need to be fair and care. So the C is about collective benefits, and that really is around the data ecosystems, and that they have to be designed from the point of view about Indigenous collective well-being and Indigenous determined benefit, and that has to include community access as well. With our authority to control, and in the major document we have these much more set out and much more robustly outlined, so it's much clearer what we want. This is just a quick shorthand version. So we really wanted to talk about co-determination of data decisions and Indigenous data rights and interests and Indigenous data governance mechanisms, because the problem that we've all been encompassing or seeing through the COVID-19 crisis has been a sort of a return to type. So even areas which had made quite strong gains in really looking at Indigenous data principles have sort of gone back to the way it's always been, and Indigenous peoples have been cut out of the co-determination and the data decisions, and especially in the US at the moment we're seeing the dissemination of Indigenous data actually resulting in harm to Indigenous peoples, because it's been picked up by the media and translated in certain ways that are actually harmful. So to remind people to be really, that we have to be really, next one, responsible, so that we need to actually talk about data justice, and it has to be meaningfully transparent, and we have to directly combat data misinformation, disinformation, and we have an accountability back to the communities from which the data are drawn. And the final one is ethics, which I think fits pretty well with the ethics that are in there at the moment, which are sort of generic and don't sort of address the Indigenous needs, is that overriding concern at all stages of the data life cycle and across the data ecosystem for Indigenous rights and wellbeing. So that's just our snapshot, but that sort of covers, I suppose, yeah, the basics of what we're doing. But we're actually, the document we have at the moment is 6 to 7 pages. By the time we get finished editing tomorrow, we think it'll probably be between 5 and 6 pages. Questions?
Well, that's great. Thanks, Maggie. And I really do want to pass on appreciation from the co-chairs and the broader community. It will be very important to get these guidelines into the document. So much appreciation.
Yeah.
And I would.
And I should point out that the group that's putting it together are the Indigenous Data Sovereignty RDA interest group. So
Yes.
We've been there.
And I see Irina has added the link to the care principles in the chat, and she's also highlighted that the care principles are mentioned in the social sciences section of the guidelines as well. So, and
Yep.
so.
But I think they're the wrong care principles.
Okay. Well, then Irina will take a look at that and make sure. Okay.
I think that they're the Scottish Health principles.
Ah, that's what you pointed out earlier.
No,
right.
no, not really.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it sounds like something we'll check to make sure they reflect the right care principles. Okay.
Yes,
so if you have any questions for Maggie, then please feel free to put them in the chat or the questions panel. So as soon as this slide refreshes, and I apologize for the delay in the slides, I'm going to ask Hilary Hanaho to speak to the outreach and dissemination piece. Hilary?
Thank you, Mark. Good morning or good afternoon, good evening to everybody. So yeah, just to update you a little bit on our plans for making this, how would you say, public and raising awareness of it. So clearly we have in the first 4 releases given it, you know, a certain amount of visibility to try and collect feedback, but the quite a significant effort will go into doing outreach and dissemination around the version that's being released on Thursday, so on the 28th of May. Why? Because first of all, we want to get feedback before the final endorsed version, particularly on areas that may be contentious, that may be incorrect, that are missing or anything like that. Because we're mindful of the fact that we are trying to generate something that should be useful, meaningful, actionable for many, many different stakeholders. So it's a long document. There are many different stakeholders inside that we're trying to target, but we want to make sure that what is produced with this huge effort that you're all investing in it, that it is impactful and that the guidelines are indeed effective. So the best thing for us to do, and we've discussed it inside the Secretariat and with the communications team, is to focus on this one for this particular phase, so that we're in time to do any changes or modifications for the next for the final version due on the 30th of June. What we are planning to do is, of course, there'll be a press campaign, the usual community outreach and social media stuff, but also a significant effort into targeted communications by myself and others, indeed, to a contact database. So the package that will be based this on is the press release, an executive summary, and the recommendations and guidelines themselves as the longer the document. And what I am asking all of you to do is, first of all, to circulate it. This is the time to circulate it to their networks. This is as close as we'll get. This is how it's going to look, the final version. Of course, there'll be a decision tree and things in later stages. So I would ask you to circulate it to your networks, your organizations, and also, please, if you wish me to create special, I'm going to be investing significant time next week in writing to people to ensure that it's on their desk and extracting information and highlights from the document and using the executive summary and the press release and other things to ensure that we get the attention of those that we want. So you see my email in the slide there. Please feel free to drop me a line with the name of a person, or indeed if you're sending it yourself and you get any feedback on it. We are looking into mechanisms for capturing impact and of the impact of this. Of course, the most impact that we really feel from RDA is that this is meaningful, it's usable, and it's actionable. But we would like to officially collect that feedback. I've had a lot of unofficial feedback, but I'd like to officially collect the feedback and the impact, and that will be from the 30th of June onwards with that release. This now is for comments, any requests or any details. And that's it from me.
All right, thanks, Hilary. So I would also echo Hilary's comments and encourage you to distribute the Thursday release in your networks and encourage people to take a look. Once they have the opportunity to take a look at the release, the link is again at the bottom of this slide, then they can use that request for comments function. It allow them to upload a document which might include additional feedback and context. We've tried to number all the sections down to the subsections, so it should be easy to refer to items. We're sensitive to the fact that there's a fair number of people in the document making comments and edits, and we did want to kind of make best use of this request for comments function to minimize the amount of comments and items in the document itself. So we would certainly encourage people to do that. And as Hilary suggested, if there are particular stakeholders that you feel would have a particularly resonant or important impact on the adoption of the guidelines, then Hilary would be happy with the RDA communications team to send out a message and ensure that we reach as many people as we can. This slide just highlights, if it's come up yet, the process for using the RFC on the landing page for the guidelines document. So again, encouraging people to make use of that. So that's the end of today's webinar. Again, just to kind of summarize, we've had an update on the process that's being undertaken right now by the editorial team. The work is pretty substantial, as you can well imagine, in a guidelines document with hundreds of links and references. So the subgroup teams have continued to do amazing work in going in and working with the editorial team to produce this next 5th release. So many thanks to everybody involved, and feel free to ask any questions or make any additional comments. I'll take a look. I don't see anything. There's a comment in the questions just regarding a potential error in the research software piece, so hopefully somebody will note that one. We'll check that and make sure we make the correction. Our next webinar is on June 9th, so that will give a substantial amount of time for people to provide feedback on the upcoming release. So we look forward to providing you with an update on what it would essentially be the final version of the document. And that's a nice short version of the webinar today. I don't see any questions or comments. Can always ask any of our presenters, Natalie, Maggie, or Hillary, if you have any final comments to make before we close today's webinar.
No, not for me.
I could just,
Nope.
I suppose, as usual, but it's say thank you so much for the effort. You know, when I was contacted and asked to do this, it was for me, in my role as the Secretary General, the first time I had ever made a specific call to action to the community for to respond. It's normally the opposite, as you know. It's the community that asks us, and we facilitate. And I think it's been quite amazing for me to follow this so closely. I also don't normally, I'm not able to follow so closely the workings of the groups. I've always known what a wonderful community I'm very lucky to support and to represent. But this is truly phenomenal. It's truly a phenomenal work. And as I said, I really appreciate your all the work that you're doing. We value very much your expertise, because that's what this is all about. And I ask you really fervently to help us ensure that this gets to the desks of the people that we wanted to get to, and to make as much noise about it as we can, because that also honors so much all the work that you have done. So I can't really thank you enough on behalf of all of RDA, but so I just say thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Hillary. That's an important message. And I would just highlight your comments maybe as my final remark, just to say that in the Canadian context, there's been a conversation around using the RDA guidelines to reflect specific Canadian resources, policy approaches, and in a sense to build on the excellent work of the RDA COVID-19 working group and reflect a few Canadian examples and specific resources for researchers. So it's a good example of where the hard work of this group has facilitated an easier task for a community, in this particular case in a national context in Canada. So I'm sure that kind of effort will continue, and we'll continue to see additional similar efforts coming out of other contexts and down the road for RDA. So thanks everybody for attending, and we look forward to getting your comments and feedback, and we will see you on June 9th. Thanks all.
Okay.
Bye.
Hello.
Bye.
Bye.